Riyadh Airport, Saudi Arabia, August 19, 1980. On the tarmac, a passenger aircraft, Lockheed L1011 TriStar of Saudi Arabian Airlines, is preparing to conduct a scheduled flight, number 163, from Riyadh to Jeddah. 30 passengers and 14 crew members board the aircraft. This flight is to be carried out by a relatively young and inexperienced crew. The captain is 38-year-old Mohammed Ali Khowyter. The first officer is 20-year-old Sami Abdullah Hassan, and the flight engineer is 42-year-old Bradley Curtis. There are 11 flight attendants in the cabin. At 18:08 GMT, air traffic control gives clearance for takeoff, and the Lockheed L1011 TriStar takes off from Riyadh Airport, heading towards Jeddah. After takeoff, the plane begins to gain altitude, gradually moving away from the airport, dissolving into the evening sky over Saudi Arabia. The crew monitors the flight parameters as the plane reaches an altitude of 6,700 meters. However, just 7 minutes after takeoff, the crew is unexpectedly alerted by an automatic fire alarm in the rear cargo hold. The flight engineer reports the issue to the captain, who in turn shuts off the ventilation in one compartment, seemingly intending to continue the flight rather than return to the airport. At this time, the alarm sounds in the second compartment. The captain asks the flight engineer, "Should we return?" To which the flight engineer replies that the smoke detectors in compartments A and B have been triggered. The captain is psychologically unprepared for the return procedure and does not fully realize how critical the situation is, and time is not on their side. All this time, the aircraft is moving away from Riyadh, and no decision to return has been made. Finally, the captain asks the flight engineer what procedures need to be carried out in case of a fire on board. Bradley Curtis begins to leaf through the quick reference handbook, but cannot find the necessary section. The tension and psychological stress among the crew members increase. The flight engineer, Curtis, takes the problem more seriously than the others and fully understands the consequences of the fire, as evidenced by the fact that Captain Mohammed Ali Khowyter is calmly humming a tune while the flight engineer is searching the manual in hopes of finding the correct procedure. Meanwhile, the fire in the tail compartment is growing stronger. The flight engineer Curtis reports that there is nothing in the manual and suggests checking the passenger cabin to see if there is any smoke in the tail section. The aircraft continues its flight towards Jeddah. The captain and first officer are surprised that the manual does not contain instructions for a fire emergency. The first officer browses through the manual and finds the necessary checklist. Meanwhile, the flight engineer Curtis returns to the cockpit and confirms that there is indeed a fire. Finally, the crew makes the decision to turn back. It took 4 minutes from the time the smoke alarm sounded to reach this decision. While the aircraft turns around, the first officer contacts the airport. A stewardess knocks on the cockpit door and reports that the fire has begun to spread to the rear of the cabin. The situation quickly deteriorates as panic begins to spread among the passengers. The captain uses the public address system to ask everyone to remain seated. Meanwhile, the pilots notify the airport of their return due to the smoke, and the Riyadh airport dispatches fire brigades to the runway. The captain instructs the head flight attendant to ensure all passengers are seated and buckled in. Until this moment, no one from the crew had declared an emergency, and the burning plane continued to move further away from Riyadh. Having received clearance from air traffic control, the captain shut down the second engine and executed a turnaround. Meanwhile, the fire in the cargo compartment spread rapidly, and the intense flames, already visible through the fuselage, were noticed by the pilots of a nearby aircraft. At the same time, the crew of Flight 163 failed to understand the instructions for extinguishing a fire in the cargo hold. The operation manual for the Lockheed L1011 TriStar was written in English, which the crew could not sufficiently understand. Consequently, it took them some time to engage the fire suppression system. After completing the checklist before landing, the crew encountered problems with the second engine. The throttle lever was stuck in one position and could not be adjusted because the plastic insulation on the cable had melted due to the fire, preventing thrust adjustment. The flight engineer, Curtis, suggests leaving the engine alone since it is working fine, but the captain disagrees. However, the flight engineer persuades the captain that it would be better to make adjustments right before landing. Panic in the cockpit intensifies. At 18:27, a flight attendant rushes into the cockpit and reports a fight that has broken out among passengers scrambling for space in the forward cabin. Alarmed passengers, fearing toxic smoke, have moved towards the front of the cabin. Flight attendants try to make the passengers return to their seats. Using the intercom, the captain asks everyone to stay in their seats and prepare for an emergency landing. The senior flight attendant once again enters the cockpit and asks the crucial question, "Will we be evacuating?" To which the flight engineer replies, "Yes, when we're on the ground." The flight attendant asks again, "Captain, will we evacuate the passengers immediately after stopping?" To which the captain replies, "It's better to." Seconds before touchdown, the captain gives a rather inexplicable command in the chaos of the passenger cabin, disturbing the balance of the aircraft. At 18:36, the crew successfully lands the aircraft without incident at Riyadh Airport. However, instead of stopping immediately on the runway, the pilots decide not to halt the aircraft and continue taxiing for almost 3 more minutes. At 18:40, the last communication from the aircraft is received, attempting to begin evacuation. It seems that the decision to evacuate was made too late. There was little help from outside as well, as the airport firefighters had never dealt with extinguishing a burning aircraft, neither during this incident nor in training. Moreover, they did not know how to open the doors of the Lockheed L1011 TriStar. By this time, the fire from the cargo hold had already spread into the passenger cabin. It took rescuers 23 minutes to figure out the instructions, which were in English. Once the emergency services opened the main door, a flash fire occurred, spreading flames throughout the cabin, engulfing the entire aircraft in just 5 minutes. The aircraft was completely burned, except for the wings and vertical stabilizer. Due to the delay in evacuation, all 301 people on board Flight 163 perished. To investigate the cause of the disaster, the Saudi Arabian authorities invited experts from the US National Transportation Safety Board and consultants from the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch. Representatives from Saudi Arabian Airlines claimed that the firefighters found a gas stove with a butane cylinder in the aircraft cabin, which allegedly exploded and caused the fire in the rear cargo hold. However, experts from the US and Britain disagreed with this conclusion. According to specialists from the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch, the fire was caused by a flammable hydraulic fluid used in the aircraft, which ignited due to a short circuit. A contributing factor to the disaster was the delay in evacuation. The airport services were unprepared for such emergencies and failed to promptly carry out their duties. Additionally, the crew's decision to taxi instead of immediately stopping on the runway after landing contributed to the tragedy. The poor proficiency in English by both the airport emergency services and the crew also played a significant role, as it hindered the emergency services from quickly understanding the instructions for opening the main doors of the Lockheed L1011 TriStar and initiating evacuation. It is noteworthy that the exact cause of death for the passengers and crew was not specified. Autopsies were not conducted on the deceased, as Islamic law requires the deceased to be buried on the day of death before sunset. The Saudi Arabian authorities strictly prohibited any examinations and handed over the victims' bodies to their relatives. Information about the nature of the injuries on the victims' bodies was recorded in reports solely based on accounts from the Riyadh airport firefighters. As of 2004, Flight 163 remains the deadliest aviation disaster in the history of the Middle East, the 8th deadliest in the history of aviation, and the 2nd deadliest in the history of civil aviation in Saudi Arabia. This incident is genuinely shocking. After taking off from Riyadh, the alarm in the cockpit was triggered in the 7th minute of the flight. However, the crew did not fully understand what had happened and were psychologically unprepared to return. This is especially true for the captain, who hesitated to make decisions. A fire is the worst thing that can happen to an aircraft. It disables control systems. The oxygen supply and masks may not last until landing. Smoke reduces visibility in the cockpit, and the smoke curtain places tremendous psychological pressure on the crew. In such cases, decisions must be made instantly because time is against the crew. However, the situation was exacerbated by the crew's insufficient or poor English proficiency, which is unacceptable. After landing, evacuation of the burning aircraft should have begun immediately. but the crew decided not to stop and taxied to the apron, wasting valuable time. What followed was utter chaos. Neither the crew nor the rescue services were able to conduct an evacuation. They managed to access the aircraft only 23 minutes later, when there were no survivors. Everyone on board the aircraft was burned alive. All of this points to the airline's low level of safety, inadequate training of the crew, and ground services. Thank you for watching. Please share your thoughts in the comments, give a like, and subscribe. Till next time.